Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening for a conversation about race and the church. I am so glad that you're with us here, and especially glad, too, that we have Pastor Reggie joining us this evening. I want to start off with a couple of invitations that if you have a comment or a question, if you have an insight or a story that you'd like to share with us, we would like this to be a community-wide event where all of your voices are heard as well. So we want to make sure that you know that you can leave a comment in the section below. Otherwise, you can feel free to direct message us, private message us into our inbox, especially if you feel like there's something sensitive that you'd like to remain anonymous about, or if there's something that you've been wondering. We're really hoping that this is going to be an honest conversation and an open exchange. Really hoping that we can make this a tremendous learning opportunity, and something that just takes some courage on our parts to face those things and also to write them out. And so as they come in, we're going to get those on stage here, and I can ask those questions to Pastor Reggie as they happen in real time. I want to start off today with, with an acknowledgement that as you came in and as we started talking, there's a tremendous element of discomfort that I sense, and in my own learnings about this, especially this past week, and trying to figure it out as a church staff, we've been looking at some materials, and reading, and also videos, and I'm recognizing that the discomfort that I sense is really because for hundreds of years in America, white people like myself, we didn't have to address race, that we had the opportunity to just glaze right over it. And the discomfort that I sense is because I'm entirely unprepared to have this conversation. I'm going to get it wrong. And I want to thank you for your gracious act of coming here and bearing with us as we all get it wrong. And just because, I'm not prepared, thank you for being here, and thank you for your grace that you've shown already. And I want to start off right now with, if you'd be willing to share a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm Reggie Smith, and I am the Director of Diversity for the Christian Reformed Church in North America. Before that, I was the Director for Race Relations and Social Justice for the CRC for about 4 years. And before that, I was a inner city pastor here in Grand Rapids for 20 years. So, and originally from Chicago.
All right, as we start to ask some of the tougher questions, I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of a background on where you come from, maybe where you grew up, formative experiences that you've had to bring you to this point. I should also mention for our viewers that Pastor Reggie has connections to our church community. You've come and preached here on a number of occasions, and that's why I was just so excited when you accepted the invitation to come here tonight as well. But yeah, maybe a little bit fuller picture for us about who you are and those formative experiences.
My parents came up in 1958 from Mississippi to Chicago, and they came to either have one of the two places in Chicago that only African Americans can go, which was the South Side or the West Side. So they settled on the West Side. And what we found out, which was part of my own experience and education in terms of race, was that I had to stay within my neighborhood. I couldn't go into a white neighborhood, say Cicero, or the western suburbs, because if I did, the possibility of me either getting beaten up or killed or some other nefarious thing could happen. So I knew from the get-go, all of my siblings were told, here's where you could go, here's where you can't go. And if you stay within those boundaries, then everything will be fine. But it also showed me that boundaries in terms of segregation in Chicago, because Chicago at that time was the most segregated city in America, in which every ethnic group had their own neighborhood, and they stayed within those boundaries, and everybody knew what those boundaries were. So it was through my education, my housing, sociologically, all those things came together in terms of where I could go and where I couldn't go.
So it's interesting that even you say that, because what I hear from that too is that you had conversations in your house with you said your brothers, about race from the very, very earliest, memories that you have. It was just a part of the conversation in your home.
Right.
And I think for a lot of us that we didn't have that. We didn't have to have that conversation. We didn't have that conversation. And it's a different world. I was wondering about how race has shaped your particular identity as you've grown over the years.
Oh, that's in a variety of different ways. I grew up in the African American church, so I had no contact with white people other than in school when I had white teachers. And so all of my life, it was spent within African American spaces, African American circles. And it was not until I went down south, because my parents are from Mississippi, and we go down there because that's where my grandmother lived, and because there were so many grandkids, and she had a farm, and we were free labor, so it worked that way. But when we would go into town, my grandmother would always caution us, or my uncles would, okay, don't talk to that white man, don't do this or don't do that. That may be a sign of offense. And it became very clear to me how different it was between blacks and whites in Mississippi in the late 1970s. But then coming back to Chicago, it was even more when a couple of friends of mine, we started to ride our bikes across this expressway called the Stevenson Expressway, which is a dividing line between the Hispanics and ethnic whites. And we crossed this boundary because we wanted to go to the movies because they had a really good theater there. And I remember we were chased by white guys in a car who said, "You don't belong here." And they ran us back to the other side of the Stevenson Expressway. And they didn't cross past, they didn't go north of the Stevenson. They stayed south of the Stevenson. But we knew once we got past there, we were safe. But that was part of my education, because it wasn't something that would just be a mistake. I could actually lose my life being in that space because I was not welcome there and I was not expected to be there.
I'm wondering if was it your impression too that those men chasing you, do you think that they feared losing their lives if they crossed over? Or is it just their rule, their internal kind of understanding?
Right. It's their rule because they're protecting their turf. And so I'm sure if they were crossing to the other side, into the Hispanic neighborhood, and then on to the African American side, I'm sure that they would not feel safe even there. But I remember as a kid, because I watched white people would go, the only time that white people would ever stop in my neighborhood was if their car broke down. That was the only time that any white people ever stopped in my neighborhood. And it was really a shock to me when I found out about this church that was only 2 blocks from my house and that white people went there. I had never seen that before in my entire life, of white people and black people going to church in my neighborhood, which is 99.9% African American. And so that began also part of my education, and part of my journey is, why were they going to church in my neighborhood? And that intrigued me, of why is this church so different?
Yeah, we have to follow up with that. Why? I mean, you must have thought your experience with white people, as the dividing lines and what you've been told by family members, wasn't exactly encouraging of a cross-cultural exchange. I mean, it was dangerous at times. Why would you put yourself in a position where you would go to the church? I mean, I guess maybe were you afraid at the time, or were you curious? Yeah, talk to me. What was that initial experience like?
I was curious because my brother was the one who told me about this church. And he said, this church has a basketball court in it. We're like, what? It has a basketball court? That was unheard of. I had never gone to a church that had a multi-purpose room in the 1970s. So this intrigued us beyond. So I end up following him to this church called Lawndale Christian Reformed Church, and got to know the pastor there, who got us all together, a lot of African American young men who to start a church basketball team, and that was my introduction into this church. And then there was a lady by the name of Barbara Clayton, African American woman who worked there as the director of religious education, and she was just the nicest person there. And so here it is this white minister and this black woman who are attending this church in my neighborhood. And they said, well, you can come to church here. So I said, yeah, I'll come and check it out. I said, and then I saw whites and blacks worshiping together in this same space. And that intrigued me because, again, I had never seen that before. And you have to understand that in Chicago, it is a very awkward thing, or say like it becomes a very awkward thing when the races get together, something breaks out, and it's never often that good because of how race is seen in not only politics and education, but race permeates everything in Chicago. And so when Lawndale shows me this different picture, I was intrigued by that and said, why are you really here? And the real story is that Lawndale actually started off as a Jewish outreach from the Christian Reformed Church. And then it began to change around the late 1950s as African Americans who were part of the Great Migration, which were a part of 6 million African Americans coming from the South to the North, which my parents were a part of that migration. And they decided that they would stay, even though that they were no longer ministering to Jewish people who were the original residents of Lawndale. And so the more I found out about this history, which was very unique, that they not only stayed, but that they were willing to fight for racial justice. And how that came up is because there was a time when African-American children who attended Lawndale could not go to the Christian school, which was located in Cicero. And the reason why they couldn't go is because the school board thought it would be dangerous for them, because Cicero at that time was probably the most racist place in the Chicago area. In fact, it was so racist that Martin Luther King called Cicero probably the most hardest place he's ever been, and that includes the South. And so Timothy Christian was located in Cicero, and so the school board prevented them because they were afraid that the kids would get hurt. But in actuality, they were afraid that their own kids would get hurt. And so out of that, there was a fight for almost 4 years in which black children who couldn't go to that school were invited to go to Des Plaines Christian School, which was 30 miles north. And so imagine if you are a child who has to get up at 6 in the morning, get on a bus, travel 30 miles, go to school, get out at 3, travel back. Most of those kids got back home about 9 o'clock at night. And they repeated that again the next day. And so for some of my friends who I knew at Lawndale, they did this for 5-6 years before Timothy finally moved to further out to Elmhurst. And then that's when they invited them. But it was the first time in which those parents who could not, those African American men who could not go to Timothy, became part of a conversation about race that happened in the Christian Reformed Church, that it almost split the church in half because we had never dealt with the issue of race.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, like it's a multiracial or biracial congregation that was sort of living and worshiping together, but somehow found a way to do that, like without having that direct conversation about race until things
until it involved children.
Yeah,
and involved parents who were covenant parents, wanted the best for their children, wanted the same thing as just as any other parent, and yet denied that access. And it became part of a larger conversation in which race stood at the very center of what does it mean to be a Christian when we have an opportunity to say, is the gospel really larger than our cultural understanding or our cultural anchor where we're at?
So how old were you when this was happening?
I was about 10 years old.
Okay. So you could kind of see, and if you couldn't, I guess as a 10-year-old articulate, the context of everything, you maybe had some feelings, right, about like angst and what was going on. I guess how did that hit you as a kid, watching this thing play out?
Well, it hit me really. I would say it when I was a 10, but when I went to seminary,
okay,
and I was taking a church history course, and I had to come up with a topic, and so I said, well, why don't I do the one on the Timothy Lawndale thing? And I knew some of the kids who are now a little bit older than me were still going to that church, and there was a box that I discovered with the proceedings, the legal proceedings, because it was taken to federal court.
Oh.
And those proceedings were in the basement of the church. And I had the opportunity to look through those proceedings and to find out, oh, this was the first time that a CRC church has taken another CRC organization to court. This had never happened before. And to read through those proceedings, it gave also a picture of what was happening with the Christian Reformed Church in terms of its conversation with itself about race, because now it was right in their preview. It was right in Senate. And now they had to have this conversation if can an African-American parent be allowed to go to a Christian school that's only 15 minutes away, but deterred to go to one that is 30 miles away when they refuse to be courageous enough to provide protection for not only those African-American children, but for all the children who would possibly have gone to Timothy Christian when it was in Cicero.
So what was the logic that you could kind of put together between like the justification for saying, no, you can't come to this school?
I would say the justification was a lack of courage.
Okay.
And I think because it was located in Cicero, which was a very, very racist suburb, and they felt that for those parents who were attending, felt that maybe their children would be hurt. But I want to say at the same time, there were some very courageous teachers there were 4 teachers at that time who protest when children were not allowed to go, and they left. And so I'm thankful for those kinds of teachers, those kinds of individuals. They were able to meet the moral moment. And I think that has reference to even today. What does it mean for us to meet the moral moment when it's there?
I need somebody needs to like leave that one in the comment section below, right? The moral moment. That's good. Because we're in one of those, right? The moral moment, and trying to think about how to do the right thing. And what you said, it comes down to that simple word of courage, right? That's so good. Throughout this process, I'm wondering, especially as it relates to your identity as a member in the body of Christ, that you're a Christian and you've lived out this experience, this ugliness within the church and structures of the church. I mean, man, it is incredibly easy to just, no, I'm going to let that thing go, right? But you saw Christ through it all, and you saw Christ first and foremost. And then you decided at some point, you said you went to seminary, and he became a pastor, and even a real significant, a strategic leader in the church.
Right.
How does that happen?
That happened kicking and screaming because initially I did not want to be a pastor. I wanted to be a lawyer. And I wanted to be a lawyer because I thought, that looks really cool on TV. And they usually solve their mysteries in 22 minutes, including commercials. So I thought this is probably the way to go. And so most of my intention was to become a lawyer. So even through high school, through college, and I was going to come back, Chicago, start a law clinic, and become a lawyer. And the Lord messed that up for me because he has a way of just telling what your dreams are, and he'll laugh at you. And he was doing a whole bunch of laughing at me as I saw all of these doors slamming in on me to become a lawyer, and all of these doors that open up in terms of ministry. And I didn't like it one bit. And I said, Lord, I want to do a good profession. I can do this. Open up the doors for me. But he didn't. And he said, no, I have this for you. And I drug my feet. I didn't want to go to seminary. I didn't want to leave Chicago. But then all those doors opened up. And I'm like, oh, okay, let's just try it. Say I hate it, and then I'll leave. And he ends up finding those kind of ways in which he puts hooks that you really don't see, that are pulling you, that are dragging you, and you're trying to fight against the force. You know what I'm talking about there. And that there's nothing you can do about it. So the first thing he did was give me a white wife. So that really just jacked me up right there.
Yeah.
But that became part of, again, my racial education and journey of how now do I begin to embrace this part of me?
Yeah.
Where now, my wife Sharon, once we got married, that it was very difficult to trying to live in both of these worlds, and at the same time maintain the relationships that we had. It wasn't easy, but that was through seminary, and then we ended up lovingly had my first church was in Patterson, New Jersey. And as we're driving in, we were pulled over by the Clifton cops. And we were pulled over because I had these different license plates, Michigan and Illinois. And the cop says to me, he said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm moving into this neighborhood.
Yeah.
He said, no, you're not. We don't have your kind here.
The officer said that.
Oh, well, I can tell you exactly where I'm going to be moving. And then he kind of just gruffly said, oh, gives me my license and my registration and lets me go. But those are kind of the moments that happens to African Americans, no matter where they're at, because there's a real pressure to maintain what is already going on. Because, if we're honest with ourselves, we're more drawn to similarity than we are to diversity.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the similarity than the diversity. We talked a little bit about this earlier, that the message that I got about race growing up in a hugely white community is we focus on our similarity, that we focus on we're all human beings, right? One race. And I wasn't taught to see color or to acknowledge color, right? Which now I understand is a significantly privileged position, and it makes all kinds of assumptions about people, and it really minimizes a lot of the stories. But I'm wondering about if you could tell us a little bit about how it's important to talk about race, about color, about stories, these backgrounds.
Social psychologist says that children recognize race as soon as they're born. And because children recognize race, it seems kind of weird that adults are saying, oh, I'm colorblind. Yeah. I just see people. So unless you are Ray Charles or Stevie Wonder, you do see color.
Yeah.
And I think it becomes part of a defense mechanism that I think that white people use in order to assuage themselves that they have a race, that it does matter, that they do care about it. And
Yeah.
once you acknowledge that, that is probably 80% of the way of dealing with or coming to grips with or beginning this journey
Yeah.
of, wow, I really need to see what is actually in front of me.
Yeah. So you're saying that I could look at somebody of color and say, you have a perspective to share. And sometimes we do that in the church as well, of saying, you're a black man, you have a perspective that I'm not going to see. But somehow it often means like, well, since I'm white, I don't have a perspective because it's just the normal or the baseline perspective, right? Which is all kinds of messed up. Yeah. And that's sin in a nutshell. Right. But if I acknowledge, oh, I have a perspective too, it's hard for me to say that, right? Because it's a little bit, if I'm going to be honest with you, it's like, well, I want to believe that I have the perspective,
Absolutely.
not a perspective.
Absolutely.
That's uncomfortable.
It's very uncomfortable. But you know, what's more uncomfortable to say, I sin?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or I'm wrong?
It's hard.
Both of those statements are hard because it means that you can't always be at the center of the story.
Yeah.
It means to acknowledge that when you say all lives matters,
Right.
really means just most lives matters.
Mm-hmm.
And then we give ourselves a pass to say, well, I get to determine which lives matter.
Right.
And which has an historical perspective to it from 1619, when the first Africans came to these shores. It was recognized that there were differences.
Yeah.
It was recognized that who was working for whom.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a part of our history. And when we begin to recognize that history and come to grips with it, internalize it, when you say this is the perspective, when you say that white is normal,
Right.
it is to say, could I be wrong? It becomes to open up a huge avenue in which you become more curious than defending your narrative.
So what are some things that you're seeing around that break your heart? And what are some things that you're seeing that encourage you?
Yeah, I would say I look at May, this past May 2020 was probably the thing that broke my heart the most.
Okay. And you've seen a lot.
There's been a lot that went on in May 2020. In fact, I would say that's the month that you need to mark in your historical calendar.
Okay.
Because of all the things that happened. There were 4 things that happened in May. The first one was Ahmaud, who was jogging in Georgia, and Team McMichael wanted to hunt him down and kill him. That following week, we learned about Breonna Taylor, who in her Louisville, Kentucky apartment, along with her boyfriend, who were mistaken for someone else, broken in, shot 8 times. You know, Breonna is from Grand Rapids. But we didn't hear about it until the second week of May.
Yeah.
And then the third week, Amy Cooper, who was had a dog off a leash in the brambles in Central Park in New York. And Christian Cooper tells her to leash her dog because he's an avid bird watcher, a black man. And we watch almost in real time this liberal Democratic woman flipped to turn race, weaponized her gender, weaponized her race, weaponized her phone. And we watch her put on this Academy Award performance that a black man was threatening her. And then the final week was George Floyd. And so I think that's going to be a seminal month that we will remember for why what is happening right now is happening.
Yeah. I mean, it just goes like it builds, right? That's what I hear you saying. Just up and up and up until it can't be ignored anymore.
Right. And then you ask, what encourages me? What gives me hope?
Yeah.
What gives me hope is young white people getting into the streets and protesting about these kinds of issues. Because I think, if more than anything, I think they recognize the moral moment more than adults.
Yep.
And because of that, they have continued this drumbeat, whether that's police brutality, Black Lives Matter,
Yep.
Lifting up the things that are happening before us, where before, none of that. Remember, Ahmaud happened the first week of May. It didn't happen till the final week of May, and something snapped. And I think because of what happened to George, it became a catalyst for something even more, in which I think young people were saying, regardless if there is even a pandemic, we are willing to protest. It's almost as if they are teaching the older generation how to rediscover courage again. That gives me hope.
Yeah, I'm thinking back into your story that you shared as well, those teachers at Timothy School, that you said four teachers. White teachers?
White teachers.
Who said
that's all that was there at Timothy.
That's all that was there.
That's all that's there is just white teachers.
And it wasn't a big school, I'm imagining. Or
kind of medium, medium. Yeah.
But four teachers walking out makes a difference.
Yep.
Right? And they use that moral moment, act courageously.
Yep.
And they make a stand and put action behind it.
Yep.
And things start to change.
It began a chain reaction that people could no longer ignore it, because it's usually we use our cultural pressure to squelch it, or to put it down, or to bring them back into the fold that you really didn't know what you were doing, but we forgive you. Now come back and assume the homeostasis of what is comfortable.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I'm kind of a young white guy.
Are you?
I'm super white, but I'm
talking about the young part.
Young, right? That's what. As soon as I said that, I was like, "What is your advice for me? There's a moment happening, and I so deeply appreciate you coming here and sharing, because we've done ministry in similar circles. We have a lot of overlapping spheres. That seminary you went to was here in Grand Rapids. I believe it was the same one I went to.
Same one.
And wondering what advice you would tell me and people like me. This is the moment. This is the courageous thing. Help me out.
Yeah, I would say to you, and for others like you, for other pastors, I would say to take this moral moment and do one courageous thing, which is to have a crucial conversation with a parishioner or a member who is having trouble understanding this moment.
Yeah.
It's very difficult for me as a Black man to change all white people.
It's not your.
It's not my job.
Your job.
It's not my job.
Let's acknowledge that. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that every white person can convert the people within their own sphere of influence, and that is even more powerful. I am now encouraged by a lot of people who are now having those kinds of conversations now, and who are now pushing even their parents or grandparents to take action. I mean, a wonderful thing is that Black Lives Matter was considered a heresy 5 years ago. Now, Black Lives Matter is now being embraced by more white people than ever before.
Yeah.
And I think it's because of what this moment is, that people are recognizing this moment, and that people like you can also encourage that moment to step out with some courageous steps in terms of having those kind of conversations.
One crucial conversation, or maybe an ongoing crucial conversation with one person, right? Is that if we do that, if everybody watching this, listening to this, hears from you and acts that way, things start to change.
Yep. I don't know if this was a rabbi way back during the time of Jesus. He said, the work is not yours to complete, but it's also not yours to give up.
Yeah.
You can't.
We just got to let that sit for just a minute.
Just let it sit for a while.
Let it breathe. Say it again. The work is not.
The work is not yours to complete, but you're also not at liberty to give it up.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something powerful about that, is that so that you don't be overwhelmed.
Yep.
By the vastness of this issue, but at the same time, you are held responsible.
Yeah.
For what you do with that moment, because I don't want to be that parent. I mean, and think about it, that when your kids ask you, Daddy, what did you do when this was happening? And what answer would you tell your son or your daughter? That is a moment in which you can say either, this is what I did, or this is what I failed to do. And that is the kind of legacy in which we will pass on. Big visions happen from small steps.
When you put it in those terms of this darkness, when your child asks you the question, when this was going on, May 2020, a seminal month that we're marking our calendars, these 4 things happened, and everything started to change, and it heated up. What did we do? What did I do? We're talking about resources. One of the things that we have to do, I love what you just said, talking to our kids. That's one of them that at Encounter Church, we've tried to hit a few different ways now of saying, have this conversation. It's difficult. Like how I opened with, we're bad at it. A lot of us didn't have that talk from our parents, and now we're trying to find the way with our kids. So we're putting up a website together. It's semi-built out already. It's at encounterchurch.org/endracism, and we're collecting resources to put on there. Things like talking to your kids, things like materials, videos, books, things to learn more, to listen from other people's perspectives. This conversation is going to live on there. What is there anything that you can think of that you're like, this has been helpful, for the conversation, or maybe your office has some materials? Like, what are you thinking should be included on that resource as well?
I would say go to our website for race relations, crcna.org, and go to resources on that page, and you will find books and videos and all kinds of articles which will be helpful for you to begin this journey that you're already on. And also that if you would like to find out even additional resources, you can go to the network in which the Christian Reformed Church has a statement, and under those statements, you'll find a plethora of resources at your disposal, and I encourage you to take full advantage of them.
We've got a few comments that came in through direct message, through comments below, and I just want to share a few of those. Again, we're asking for questions. We're asking for comments, stories that you have, trying to make this a wider conversation with just as many people as we can. So I just want to share a couple of those with us now. One person wrote, I grew up in the Chicago area, but did not have discussions on race until the 1960s, when many of the protests in Chicago were happening. And again, I think that's an interesting moment right now. I hear that and I think, okay, so I was out of town last weekend, but you have this experience too as a preaching pastor for a couple more years than I have, right? I went to bed on Saturday night 2 weeks ago, and I think the last thing my wife said to me, I go to bed very early on Saturdays, which I think you'll appreciate. there was a protest in Grand Rapids. It looks very, very peaceful.
I was there.
You were there.
Yes, I was.
I woke up on Sunday very, very early, and a lot happened the next time, right? It demanded to be talked about on Sunday later that day, you know? So I was just wondering, can you, I guess, comment on, maybe why, when you hear this card about somebody who grew up in Chicago and just didn't hear anything, we didn't talk about it, it's a big city and you could avoid it for a little while. Comment on when you hear that, what goes through your head?
It's not surprising to me because it's because of our social networks. And our social networks, if you grew up in the 1960s, it didn't matter if you grew up in Chicago or Iowa or Washington or California or Massachusetts. You lived in a bubble. You lived in a secluded place in which you didn't have to deal with that.
Yeah.
And because of that, it's just to recognize of how our culture operated at that time. And life was based on three things: church, home, and school. And because of that, those were the things which kept social cohesion, but at the same time also created a social bubble. And for me, growing up at the same time, I grew up in an African American context where I didn't really have to. I had to interact with white people, whether I like it or not.
Right.
And I think that we have to understand social networks are powerful. And in order to step out of a social network, it's, again, similarity and diversity. It is to be open and curious about other perspectives, other people. And some of that rubs off on us. And then when we bring those different perspectives back to our social network and begin to engage, we find out resistance.
Yep.
And what we all like, and myself included, I like to get along with people. I like to be liked. But sometimes, and I've read this, Jesus wasn't always well liked by the social network he came out of.
Yeah.
And he began to operate in a way in which, how can you do this, Jesus? Why are you talking to these people? Why are you, sinners and tax collectors and short IRS agents? Why are you doing this? And Jesus says, this is what it means to be in the kingdom of God. That we cross these borders, that we cross these lines, because the kingdom is so much bigger and much more interesting than just our own little bubble.
Yeah. One question or one comment that I thought was interesting to share was one person drew the distinction between some of what they grew up and World War II and Nazi Germany. I do not recall any conversations about races, just some about World War II and what the Nazis did to Jewish people and how some Dutch resisted, but nothing regarding the USA. And I resonate a lot with that. And it seems like we're very open to condemning that violence. What's your take? Why do you think we don't talk?
Yeah, the war was between 1941 and 1945.
Yeah,
in which there were over 225 African American World War II who were also fighting.
Yeah,
in Germany and in France, and who were liberating a lot of those same places in which Jews were at.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, they were in segregated units. And I knew some of them. And yet they would come back to their own United States, and they did not get the same benefits as those white GIs. They didn't get the same benefits that helped to boom suburbia.
Yep.
And at
they
the
all
same,
pushed ahead.
They all got the GI Bill.
Yeah.
African American vets didn't get that, and they all went back to the South under the same conditions where they may have gotten decorated, but they were still a boy in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia. And that is part of the bubble. Those two worlds, because there are two Americas.
Yeah.
There was one that's white, and there was one that's African American. And until we recognize that that is part of our history, then we can't really move further. We are only better. The history we acknowledge is absolutely true.
Yeah. Well, when I listen to you talk about history and some of the facts and figures and stories that you share, I mean, part of me thinks that we just had two different educations.
We did.
We did.
We did. We had two different educations.
I don't even know what to do with that. I just wanted to highlight it, I guess, that I just feel like I didn't know that. I didn't know that African Americans didn't get the bill, or they didn't get the support, and I'm just imagining somebody who put everything on their line for their country and comes back, decorated, as you said. And it's hard to hear.
And that's part of what kind of story are we really writing?
Yeah.
Where we have these great ideas of democracy and freedom.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, those same ideas were not being enacted equally.
Right.
And we have to come to grips with the inequities in which we stand on.
Yeah.
And have the kind of conversation that acknowledges.
Yeah.
Again, it goes back to the most humbling, the most courageous thing that a person can ever say is this: I'm sorry. I was wrong. If you've ever had an argument with your wife.
Yeah. No, never. Not once.
No, because you're perfect. No. And those brief times when you may have erred.
Yeah. Thank you.
When we say those words to another human being, something happens.
Yeah.
They change.
Yeah.
And I believe that the posture of being I'm introducing another word, to be anti-racist, is to practice humility.
Mm-hmm.
Humility is the posture of beginning a different story that leads to walking together.
So I'm sorry. That's the heart of the gospel, right?
That's what I learned. We went to the same seminary, right?
We get there together.
That's what I was told.
Right. That repentance, that Jesus, I need to give this to you. I cannot carry it. But the pain involved there is to acknowledge that there's a problem. Acknowledge that I didn't learn something, and now I'm hearing that I don't know something, and now that I know that, if I choose to ignore it afterwards, it's sin. It's not just ignorance now, it's sin. And Jesus offered to pay that, to carry it, to bury it in the grave and leave it there. But we have to do that work of saying it. I'm sorry. Now, you know a little bit about our church, Encounter. You've been here. So I don't want to put you in too much of a, hey, now you have to, please tell us everything. But one of the questions that came in, that was definitely something to share along here, is we are a largely white congregation. What should we be doing differently?
I'm going to repeat the same thing I said the last time I was here, which is put yourself in the spaces in which you will be in diverse populations, and love the posture of holy awkwardness.
Holy awkwardness.
Holy awkwardness. It simply means give up the persona that you have to know everything.
Yeah.
And that it's okay to be a non-dancing white guy, and be okay with that, because at the end of the day, what they're looking at, if any person who wants to build a relationship with you, how real are you?
Yeah.
How authentic are you? Are you really interested in my life, or am I just a project?
Yeah.
People are drawn to people. Dale Carnegie had it right. Just simply be more interested in people than yourself.
People than yourself.
It's no different.
Yeah.
And if Encounter becomes interested in people who are different than them, then they will see the real you.
Yeah.
And they will give you grace when you make mistakes, because they're going to happen. And then along the way, what you will be able to do is to, when we talk about privilege, and this is my tagline, admit the benefit.
Yep.
Just admit the benefit.
The benefit of
being white.
Yep.
And once that is acknowledged and put on the table, something amazing happens. You get grace.
Yeah.
It's not to say that you're going to be perfect. In fact, you're going to be imperfect. All of us are going to be imperfect till we get home.
Yep.
But in that time, what it does is that it builds an opportunity to build a relationship that goes further than not just what you can give, but really who you are.
Yeah. But yeah, grace isn't for perfect people, is it?
Never has been.
Never has been. Yeah. Grace is for people who mess up and get to be forgiven because of what he has done. I think this person might know you. So we had, could we offer one of the CRC race relations workshops at Encounter? So I don't know.
Yes.
So I imagine they might have a little background information that I might not be privy to, but go ahead.
Yes, of course there can be a workshop that's done here at Encounter. All you have to do is get a hold of the office and set it up.
Set it up.
That's all you got to do.
I like it. I want to give you, I guess, last word, parting thoughts, a resource. What can we, well, we got more. Let's do that. You have a little bit of time to think about your comment here.
Yeah.
Let's see what we got going on here.
Thank you.
Or what can I do as a white person when I'm out walking and see a person of color passing me, besides smile, to show that I believe their life matters to me?
I think that it's going to take one more than just one pass.
Yeah.
I think you have to ask yourself the question: Is this a person that you are walking past, or you see each other every time that you come along? And then that can be an opportunity of just striking up a conversation. You know what? I've been passing you for these last 3 or 4 days, and I just want to say hi and just get to know you. And again, it's embracing this holy awkwardness.
Holy awkward.
And just say, I just want to say hi to you, and if that's possible, fine. If not, that's fine too.
What a broken world, though, right? They just call it out. What a broken world that we live in, where we have to ask that question just to let somebody know that their life matters. Like that's, I don't know. It's just an observation that that's a rough place to be. I'm glad for the question, but I'm sad for us as a society where that's where the conversation is.
It is no accident that to see white people holding signs protesting that Black Lives Matter. And the most important thing to embracing human, or to embracing one's own humanity, is to know that you matter to other people. That you're not just this lone soul on some isolated island, and that nobody cares, because nobody wants to be alone. Nobody wants to be by themselves. But we live in a culture and in a society that places value on others and devalues others. And we have to recognize that when we talk about Grand Rapids, that what happened when there was a peaceful protest, and then it turned into to looting and damage that hadn't been seen since the last riot that was in 1966. Martin Luther King says that a riot is poor people trying to get attention. And I think it's one of those moral moments, because it hadn't happened since 1966, that people are saying what in Grand Rapids needs to change that has not been noticed or paid attention to since 1966? And how do other people get to be empowered and to be a part of the decision-making process in this city or in this context? Because it's been ignored for an awful long time.
Yeah, and that ties into our next one, that what should we demand of our elected leaders in regards to ending racism?
Oh, just going for the big one, huh? You ain't gonna settle for like a single or a double. You just gonna go straight home run on me.
I left off the first 4 words in this election year, so I wanted to soften it a little for you.
Well, if it was Kentwood, you have a history of having a black mayor, Bill, and having even council people who have been people of color, and I think that's something to emulate and to be proud of. Yeah. But also at the same time not to rest on your laurels,
right? Because
Kentwood continues to be a changing community, and that's going to be happening for the next 10 years. Mm-hmm. And how does that work? And maybe even asking this question: how does the police treat people of color in Kentwood? And all that is public record. It is available to any resident of Kentwood to ask that question. And I'm sure that they've probably even never been asked that.
Yeah.
But I think that's something worthy to say. So what would racial equity look like in Kentwood? Yep. What would racial equity look like in Wyoming? Yep. And when we begin to ask those kinds of questions, we're going beyond just individual racism, but now we're going into what institutional racism looks like. Yeah. And expect resistance, but be of good cheer. Yeah. You are fighting the good fight.
Yeah. We had heard some good stuff from you tonight. I like the moral moment, act courageously, find those courageous moments. Last word for us. What anything that is on your heart to share with everybody watching in, listening in, that you'd like to share with Encounter?
I would like to say to Encounter is to keep being discomfort with the discomfort, and never settle for just going back to the way things were, because they're not going to return back to the way that they were. And now, what is the Lord asking of you in this pregnant moment, this moral moment, that says, this is going to be a place in which we will fight for being a diverse people of God, because it's worth it. And it's worth our time, and it's worth our resources, and it's worth asking some of those hard questions and implementing some policies that works towards that. That's my last word.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for accepting the invitation to come. I know you're an extremely busy person. As we're talking earlier, that your office is open year-round, not just in March or May 2020 in these moments, but about this being a longer conversation over a longer period of time. I just cannot reiterate how grateful I am for you accepting and for you being here tonight. I also want to say thank you to everybody who's been writing into questions and comments and sharing some of your stories. This one doesn't end tonight, but it's meant to be a conversation that's ongoing with additional resources at encounterchurch.org/endracism. We want to make sure that this isn't just a one-off conversation, but continuing on. I also have been talking to a lot of folks about where do we go from here and what do we do from here. I love, Pastor Reggie, what you shared about that crucial conversation and who that's going to be. And I want to encourage you in a moment of courage to maybe write down what the name is of that person that you're going to talk to and put it where you're going to see it, and keep on praying for an opportunity to act courageously, to follow through on it. As we just heard tonight, that is how change happens. I also want to encourage you that if you want to have this conversation more broadly, that we as a church would love to put resources behind gatherings of people to look at some anti-racism materials and videos and articles books, whatever it may be. We really want to help. And I think, Pastor Reggie, I could count on your support as well to help us know what those resources are going to be.
Absolutely.
So we've got tons of opportunities ahead, and I think now is the moment to do something, to act somehow, and to talk to someone. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. We'll see you soon.